which is a really important system, especially to look at after we've spoken about the cardiovascular system. And so the respiratory system works hand in hand with the circulatory system, as we saw before. So the whole purpose of circulating blood is to move those gases around. And where are those gases entering and leaving our system? The lungs, right? So the cardiovascular system works hand in hand with the respiratory system, as we'll go on to see here. So the first thing we want to describe is what is respiration. We always talk about the respiratory system and respiration. And although it sounds like we're generally speaking about breathing, respiration is really the process of gas exchange, okay? And so there are two types or two divisions of respiration. We've got internal respiration, which is really that cellular respiration that we talked about last semester, that use of oxygen to be the final electron acceptor within our cells, within the mitochondria, right across that internal, that inner mitochondrial membrane. And so oxygen acting as that final electron acceptor is what produces the bulk of the ATP that we need to basically live, right? To do cellular things, make proteins, hormones, move things around in our cell, et cetera, all of the processes that are synonymous with life. So that is internal respiration, that oxygen functioning as that role in ATP production, right? Oxidative phosphorylation. External respiration is the more broad sense of the sequence of events leading up to that cellular respiration. So this incorporates or includes a couple of steps. We have pulmonary ventilation. And ventilation is really the mechanics of breathing, that moving of air in and out of the lungs, purely a mechanical process. We've also got exchange between the lungs and the blood. So moving those gases back and forth, right? CO2 moving out into the atmosphere, oxygen moving into the lungs and then into the capillaries. And then we have the transportation of those gases. So CO2 also moving from tissues to the lungs, oxygen moving from lungs to tissues. And then the final part here is the exchange between the blood and body tissues. So really down at the level of the capillaries that we described in the last unit, where CO2 can be exchanged for oxygen at the level of the capillary beds, as we can see on the schematic here. So these are all of the external processes that lead up to that final role of cellular respiration, which is really the internal part of respiration. Okay. All right, so in terms of the anatomy, there are certain divisions of the respiratory system. We have the upper airway, which is really kind of where air is introduced or initially comes into the respiratory system. We have the respiratory tract, which is that series of structures that leads up to the lungs. And then we also have some supporting structures in the thoracic cavity. Really important, the diaphragm that we talked about in lab, the intercostals and the ribs, the entire thoracic cavity also support respiration. And we'll talk about that really importantly as we get down to the mechanics of breathing. All right, so speaking about the upper airway, there isn't much to see here, just the nasal cavities, so the nasal region, the oral cavity, especially for mouth breathers. This is also a route of introducing air into the respiratory tract. And then we have the pharynx. So from the nasal cavity and oral cavity up until the pharynx, this is called the upper airway, okay? The rest of the way down from the pharynx all the way down to the lungs, this is called the respiratory tract, okay, really important. The respiratory tract is then further divided into two distinct regions. We've got the conducting zone, and then we've got the respiratory zone. Can anyone predict the difference between the conducting and respiratory zone? So what does it sound like the conducting zone is responsible for? How would you just sort of guess, just by looking at these two terms, the difference in function? Okay, so I'm seeing the mechanics of breathing. I'm also seeing physical movement. Okay, so those are some good guesses. Yes, and so that's perfectly correct. The conduction producing gases. Yep. And so yes, that's correct. So the conducting zone is purely about moving that air down into the lungs. There's no exchange taking place just yet. It's really about moving the air down and then humidifying and warming the air, which we'll see later on. Okay, the respiratory zone is where we actually begin to see exchange. All right. Let's actually kind of skip right over this. This is probably from a previous packet. Okay, so looking at the divisions of the respiratory tract, so remember all of this is respiratory tract, which differs from upper airway. And then within respiratory tract, we have two further divisions: conducting zone, which is the proximal part of the bronchial tree, and then the respiratory zone, which is the very distal part of this. So this is pretty much an introduction to how these structures are changing as we progress down the bronchial tree. And I don't want you to memorize anything here. What I really think is more valuable is to think about the trends that we're seeing. So first of all, the major trend is the size, right? The diameter, the inner diameter of these structures. We're going from about 35 to 45 millimeters all the way down to 0.3 millimeters, so very, very small. And as we go down this bronchial tree, the diameter of these structures gradually gets smaller. The other trend that we want to think about are the cilia and goblet cells. And we'll speak about the function of cilia and of goblet cells because they're kind of connected. They work in coordination with each other. But the general trend that we see for both of these structures is that it gradually decreases as we go from the proximal larynx all the way down to the alveoli, okay? And then the next thing we want to think about is cartilage and smooth muscle, right? These are also somewhat connected. Cartilage is going to gradually get, it's going to get less as we go down, whereas smooth muscle is going to gradually increase. And if you think about the function of these two structures, that'll help you remember why both of those things are working in opposition. So at the proximal part of the bronchial tree here, where we have the larynx, we see these rings of smooth muscle. When we get to the trachea itself, we see C-shaped bands of smooth muscle. And the reason for this is because posterior to the trachea, we have the esophagus. And so the esophagus needs to be able to distend to accommodate food that's moving down that tube. And so we don't have cartilage at the posterior surface of the trachea. We have that free edge to allow for the accommodation of the expansion of the esophagus posteriorly. And so at the trachea, we see these C-shaped rings only covering the anterior surface. And then from the primary bronchus all the way down to the smaller bronchi, we have these wings or plates of smooth muscle. So they eventually become rings once again at the bronchus, going all the way around. But then moving down towards the distal part of the bronchi, we see these strips or these plates that are just somewhat covering areas of the diameter here. And so the purpose of cartilage is really to keep the airway open, to keep the airway expanded and patent, to allow for that movement of air to go through, especially because in the proximal parts here, we do not have smooth muscle. And if there's not much smooth muscle, we need a more rigid structure to keep the airway open. And so as we'll see, smooth muscle increases as we go down the airway, right? Working in opposition to that cartilage. So as cartilage decreases, smooth muscle increases, and smooth muscle is taking over the role of keeping the airway patent. We'll see later on that we can modify the diameter of that smooth muscle, just like we did in vessels. And so we can bronchodilate and bronchoconstrict. And so smooth muscle helps to accommodate the regulation of the radius of the airway in some of these distal parts. And then another trend that I want to point out here is that at the distal, very distal part of the respiratory tract here, specifically the respiratory zone, we have very little structures getting in the way. This part of the respiratory tract is adapted for gas exchange. So there aren't any cilia, there aren't any goblet cells. The cells are very, very small here, just like what we saw at the capillary beds, and that is to facilitate that exchange of gases. Okay, getting more into the function as we go along here, the conducting zone, we said, is that the first part of the respiratory tract. It includes the larynx, and the larynx is really the opening into the airway, right? That glottis, the glottis is what we describe as the opening or the laryngeal inlet. We sometimes call that that opening, as well as the epiglottis. And we talked about these structures in lab, right? The epiglottis being that flap-like covering that protects the glottis when we are swallowing a bolus of food. The next structure down is the trachea. And the trachea is going to be a little smaller in the diameter, right? It's about half the diameter of the larynx, so it progressively gets smaller. And as we mentioned before, we don't have cartilage going all the way, covering the entire circumference of the trachea. Rather, it's only covering the anterior diameter. And so it's only going to be these C-shaped bands of cartilage. Now, the trachea is about 10 centimeters long, and it's got about 15 to 20 of those C-shaped ridges or cartilages covering the anterior aspect. And the trachea is going to be really important for the conduction and the warming of air that we'll talk about coming up. Continue on with the conducting zone. We've got the bronchi. So the bronchi are the two main branches that we see going left and right from the trachea. And then we have the secondary bronchi. So we see about 3 of these on the right because we have 3 lobes on the right and 2 on the left. Again, we have 2 lobes on the left side. And that will further divide into about 20 to 23 or so tertiary bronchi. So a lot of branching happening here, right, beyond the level of the bronchi. We then get into bronchioles, and anything less than 1 millimeter in terms of the internal diameter here is where we get into those distal parts of the conducting zone, which are the bronchioles, and then eventually the terminal, much smaller bronchioles. Okay. Let's speak about the function a little bit more here of the conducting zone. So the conducting zone allows for what we call dead space. And dead space is the amount of air that's kind of just residing in that entire tract. So from the pharynx all the way down to the terminal bronchioles. And that holds about 150 milliliters in volume. And that air is not actively involved in any type of exchange. And that's why we call it that dead space. Now, the function of that is to increase the temperature of that air to meet the temperature of our body, right, our core. Because we're breathing in cold air, because we're breathing in dry air, especially now, especially in Minnesota, we need to warm that air. We need to bring that air up to our body temperature as a really important part of homeostasis, right? So that we're not moving that cold, dry air into our core, which could affect our core body temperature. And so the function of the conducting zone, especially that dead space region, is going to be to warm the air, to humidify the air as it moves down into the lungs. Let's describe the epithelium of the conducting zone here. So there are a couple of structures that are pertinent to the function of this region. We've got goblet cells, and goblet cells are these unicellular glands, right? They're glands in that they secrete mucus. And we can kind of appreciate the mucus granules that are sitting in these goblet cells sort of interspersed here. And then that mucus is going to have a really important function. It's going to help with clearing any debris or any pathogens, any type of airborne pathogens, pet dander, any type of external substances that could be moving in with that air. We want to be able to trap that with that sticky mucus. The second part of protecting the air is going to be the ciliated cells. And so these columnar cells that line the respiratory tract have this apical modification that's called cilia. And cilia are these hair-like structures that are at the top or apical portion of the cell, really facing the lumen of the respiratory tract, and they're beating, they're moving in this, sort of swaying-like motion, and that motion is sweeping the mucus that has trapped these pathogens and kind of moving that towards the pharynx so that can be either swallowed or expelled. As we typically know, if you have a cough or cold, that's what happens, right? This whole process or this whole sequence of events is known as the mucus escalator, okay? So the goblet cells working in tandem with the ciliated cells helps to trap that debris in that sticky mucus environment, and then the beating motion of the cilia of those epithelial cells is what moves that trapped mucus with that debris towards the pharynx to either be swallowed or to be otherwise expelled. Okay. All right, now here is a sort of a closer histological look of this electron micrograph showing the histology of these structures. And what we can see more distally here is cartilage, okay? We can also appreciate these goblet cells, right? These unicellular glands. And we can also see some of those mucin granules inside of this goblet cell. And then toward the luminal surface here, we can appreciate the cilia, which are those apical modifications of these columnar cells, right? These epithelial cells lining the respiratory tract. And so this brings up a really interesting clinical correlation here. So these cilia that are located in the lumen here are actually paralyzed by tobacco smoke. And so this is where we get that chronic smoker's cough from. The paralysis of the cilia that are found at this region is what then creates this congestion, right? The fact that we now have mucus trapping whatever dirt, debris, pathogens that are coming in from the air, but then we don't have a means of moving that trapped mucus and debris towards the pharynx is what creates that congestion that's usually seen with chronic smokers. And so they usually have to be vigorously coughing to expel that mucus on their own because of the inability of the cilia to move. The cilia are just really standing still and they're not beating and moving and waving the way that they are in healthy individuals. Okay, really interesting